Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that new theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 127 with Maram Taibah. Maram writes fantasy and has loads to say about world building and trusting your instincts as a writer, so it's a nice little chat. A very quick catch up from me first, and there isn't too much to say about new writing, so that certainly will be quick. And that's not to say I haven't been flexing my creative muscles in other ways, having completed a couple of musical projects and also finishing the filming for a Skype-based drama script that I wrote. That involved overcoming a number of technical challenges to allow me to direct two actors as they performed what I hope will be an emotional 10-minute film about finding connection in the most unexpected of places and at the strangest of times. I'm going to be editing that this week, and I've also been collaborating on the soundtrack with my usual compadre George Odom. I'm hoping to get the film out into the world over the next couple of weeks, and it will be free to view on YouTube, so I'll keep you posted as to where you can watch that when it's available. I've also been joining three of my writing friends in a weekly novel critique session on Zoom. Each week one of the group reads a section or chapter from their whip, and the group gives critique and helps to work out any narrative issues the author might be dealing with. It's been great to connect with members of my old Phoenix Writers group, and it's forcing me to get back to the revisions on my novels, and it's my turn in the hot seat this week, so I can't put it off any longer, so I'll have to work on that chapter after all. But what about you? I know there seems like there's a big pressure to be productive, but the most important thing at the minute is that you and your family are safe and that you're kind to yourself and others. So if you're writing or singing or sewing or painting, if that makes you feel better, then great. But equally, if you want to rewatch your favourite films and TV shows or play video games, that's okay too. Personally, I've done all of that. And when I say painting, I mean painting my back garden fence because I've got zero artistic ability. But I've kept busy and I've tried to exercise every day as well. And that's basically the best that I can do under the circumstances that I find myself in. And I consider myself incredibly privileged to be able to do any of those things, because there's many people that aren't as fortunate working on the front line and having to deal with the harsh realities of this on a day-to-day basis. So wherever you are in the world and whatever your situation, I hope you're well and that you're coping okay. But feel free to reach out and let me know, because I want to hear what you're up to. So get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Maram Taibah. So Maram is a fantasy writer born in Montreal, Canada. She was raised in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and liked to escape into books from a very early age, and from there into the craft of storytelling. In addition to writing fiction, Maram is also a screenwriter and a filmmaker. In 2014, she made her first short film, Munkeer, and in 2016, Don't Go Too Far, both of which were screened at the Cannes Short Film Corner. She currently lives in Kingston, Ontario, and her novel, Weathernose, is out right now. Thanks, Maram. Thanks very much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So why don't you start us off by just telling us whereabouts in the world you're speaking from and how things are going for you at the minute?
Hi, Wayne. So glad to be on here today. I am talking to you from Kingston, Ontario. And, you know, with this pandemic going on, it's actually given me a lot more time to not to write per se, but to kind of get lost in my own fictional worlds without having to worry about, somewhere to be or something else that I need to be getting done. So I've been working on a sequel actually to my book, Weathernose. Haven't got to the writing part. I'm still in the kind of brainstorming, scribbling, sketching.
Just sort of collecting ideas.
Phase, yeah.
Excellent. Well, why don't you start off by telling us about that book? Tell us about your book, your first book, Weathernose.
Weathernose is a children's steampunk book. It's set in a steampunk universe called the Cerulean universe. And it's about an old-fashioned weatherman who wakes up one day to find that his career is being sabotaged because a little girl, 10 years old, has invented a machine that can predict the weather. And so to get his life back, he sets out to destroy her and her machine and, goes off on this vendetta against her, but he finds out that she is way smarter than him.
Brilliant. And so what kind of inspired the book in the first place? Where did that sort of come from originally? Do you remember?
I have no idea. I was bored one summer, 2006. I wrote this back when I was in college, and I was really bored, and I just the actual universe, I think, had been taking shape for years before that, but the story itself kind of just materialized and grew and matured gradually as I approached it with open curiosity, and I was just curious about what these characters were up to, and then it just started to come. And once Cypress appeared, the tension between her and the lead character, Tart Morning, became the guiding force for the story.
Absolutely.
And I just went with it.
Yeah. And why fantasy? Well, steampunk and punk and that kind of universe. Is that something that you've been interested in? Is that something you've read a lot before?
Yes, it was my bread and butter growing up. I read a lot of fantasy. I don't think I knew that there was a genre called steampunk at the time when I wrote Weathernose. I did, however, have a feel for it. I was fascinated by the aesthetic and by the concept of steampunk. I just didn't know it had a name. I didn't actually find out that it was called steampunk until years later, and I got obsessed with the genre. I find it fascinating that aesthetic kind of crept up on me without me being aware of it when I was writing Weathernose.
And for people that, maybe there's people that are listening to this that are not that au fait with steampunk and what that means, what sorts of general things does that sort of cover, that genre? What are some of the usual sort of ingredients, if you like, of that genre?
Well, steampunk is sort of, you could think of it as a celebration of steam as a source of power. At a time when the industrial age was just booming at the early 20th century, and before I knew it was called steampunk, I used to call it that thing where it's Victorian, but it's also modern and there's technology. Yeah. So it combines the whimsical aspects of the Victorian era or the Art Nouveau era with like machinery and gadgets and clockwork.
Yeah. And
you'll find that a lot in the aesthetic.
And there's a big crossover there. Yeah, it is obviously, as you say, it's a really, really popular genre, and it's kind of seeped into a lot of films and things as well, hasn't it? Yeah. There's
a show that's on Amazon, I think, right now. It's called Carnival Row. I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I haven't seen it, but I've seen it. Yeah,
but I find it amazing that it's starting to catch up. Like there's a steampunk show that is popular now.
Yeah, it just continues to grow in popularity.
Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit. So kind of how did you make your way into writing in the first place? What's kind of your earliest memories of writing, and when did you think this might be something that you'd be interested in doing in your life?
I think I've always been writing ever since I was very little. I I wrote for my own pleasure. My mother was the reason the creative world was opened up to me. She was very intent on introducing me to different kinds of creativity, like art, embroidery, cooking, building with blocks, reading. So, and I had these like arts and crafts books. So I was always in that realm. Yeah. Growing up, and writing just came to me naturally because I loved books. But it wasn't until I was 11 years old or 12 years old when it just kind of crystallized for me that this is what I wanted to do and this is what I was born to do. And I've been writing ever since.
Brilliant. And part of it, am I right in thinking that part on your journey along the way, you've kind of spent some of your time working in film and TV as well?
Yeah. In 2009 was when I realized that having done a bachelor's degree in graphic design, I realized that, while I love the visual arts world, I'm a storyteller. That's what I wanted to do. And I hadn't, as a college student, I hadn't pursued writing as a major because that wasn't available to me when I was living in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. But after I graduated, I realized that that's what I wanted to do. And the best way to do it, I was thinking pragmatically at the time. And also I was fascinated. I had always been fascinated with the film world and how films are made. I wanted to combine my visual side with my storytelling, and film seemed to be the perfect way to do that. I still write screenplays. I've directed 2 short films before. Mm-hmm. But, it got to a point later on where I had explored that area enough to come to the conclusion that, it's writing. It's always been writing for me.
And particularly, obviously you were keen to write a novel. So was Weathernose the first novel that you'd kind of completed to a standard where you thought, well, this is good enough, I want to get it out there, it is good enough to publish? Or was it a case of you'd had lots of false starts, which is often the case for a lot of people, or you tried to write other things and this was the one that sort of stuck for you?
I was writing Weathernose in a period when my creative energy was, it was just boiling, it was just simmering, and I was just writing things left, right, and center. I was writing poetry, short stories, so many different kinds of things all at once. It was the point when I was really intent on practicing the craft without thinking so much of creating something or coming up with a product. Weathernose it was so enchanting to me and fascinating, and I just loved being in that world. It was humorous. It cracked me up. And so I finished it, and it was the longest piece I had written at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think I would say that it's my first completed piece that I felt was whole and that I wanted to share with people. I just didn't share it right. I shared it with close friends, but I didn't want to put it out publicly until very recently. So it's been in the drawer all these years.
Yeah, all that time. So how did you approach it when you took it out of the drawer, so to speak? Metaphorically or otherwise. So how did you sort of approach revising it or editing? How did you find that process?
Yeah, a lot of the prose in Weathernose has been kept from the original, but I changed many things. I fine-tuned the plot a little bit, but it was just a case of weeding through the things that no longer sounded like me, because it was maybe a 10-year difference. And kind of updating it to sound like me now. Sure. But I still kept some of the gems from the original document. So I did that. And then it was a bit of a process finding an illustrator to do the book cover for me, because I was very particular about what it was supposed to look like, what the colors were supposed to look like, the atmosphere. That person had to really understand that universe and really capture the personality of it. And I worked with someone different before, the illustrator who did the actual cover now. And they didn't do a good job of that. So I had to stop the process and tell them, I'm sorry, this isn't the cerulean universe. This is not how it looks like.
Not what you had in your head.
So I looked, so I had to look for someone else, and I was very lucky to find Leah Palmer Price, who did the illustration for the cover.
It's a great cover.
And yeah, I was very happy with it. I really think she got it.
It was great. So as part of that, presumably you've especially if you're coming from a visual arts background initially, I'm guessing that you had kind of quite a clear idea in your mind. How did you approach the world building side of it? Because that's often something that people find really daunting with fantasy and sci-fi and those kind of things, where you are having to, a lot of the time you are conjuring something from nothing. So what sort of tips would you have for people if they were approaching sort of starting a new project like that and trying to build a world, a believable world?
Well, the first thing I would start off with is Cerulean Universe was something that I had been building in my mind since I was, 13 years old. And I didn't know what it was called, but it was just, I always thought of it as that place that I want to write about, that place that I wanted to write about. And I kept collecting, over the years, I kept collecting images. I stripped pages from magazines, I collected fabrics, I collected pictures off the internet, and I had this binder. And I just kept collecting stuff. And I find that is a very useful way to start with world building. It's messy at first because the picture is not quite clear when you first begin. You begin with a snapshot, and then it starts to spread and it starts to get clearer and clearer the more you gather information. Mm-hmm. So I feel like you have to allow yourself to go through this messy, spontaneous, kind of chaotic process before things start to get clear. But once you feel like you've gathered enough information, and you know what it looks like, what it feels like, what is the energy or personality of that place, that's when you start to, ask yourself questions like, well, what kind of world? Is it serious? Is it humorous? What are the laws? Like, what are the social customs in this place? How do people behave? And then you start asking yourselves all these logical questions. And, in order to write something believably, you have to have an answer for all these questions so that it's credible and it holds.
Yeah. So you sort of created almost like a what would be like in TV terms, like a show Bible almost, or like a mood board for a start. That's kind of where you started.
Yeah, a show Bible is very particular. I don't think I went as far as that, because for me, with the Cerulean universe, the process was very much intuitive. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel like I needed to word things like to actually like say this is what the world looks like and this is how people behave. But I often suggest this kind of process to people who are just starting out, just to make it easier if they're still struggling with the intuitive part of it. This is just to kind of jog things along.
And so what kind of perspective is your book written? Is it written in first person or third person perspective?
It's written in third person through Tart's point of view, like his perception.
And so did you find it quite easy to get into his head and find your way with that?
Yes. Something about like his way of things and his way of expressing himself was very distinct from me. So that kind of crept into the prose. And I allowed it because I think it is what made the book lean more towards the humorous side. Whereas if I had kept an impartial narrator voice, I don't think it would have captured the personality of this story, of the character, of the world even.
So you got into it from that point of view. So obviously you've had experience with, you mentioned you still write screenplays and things now. What do you think are the similarities and the differences? And are there things that you learned from writing screenplays that you've been able to employ in your novel writing, and vice versa? Have you got things that kind of work back in the other way in terms of characterization or whatever?
Yeah. I think the main difference between screenwriting and writing in prose, writing fiction, is the visual storytelling. So in a screenplay, you have to be very economical about describing a world, describing a character, describing the action that's going on, you need to be able to tell that visually, because that actually translates onto screen. If your character is having a thought, then you need to be able to represent that visually, so that
action,
a viewer can understand. That's how you're communicating. You're using visuals to communicate. I think a lot of people who start out as screenwriters have a little bit of trouble with that. It's challenging to kind of switch from a prose, directed mind to a visuals directed mind. But once you start to get it, it's actually quite delightful, because it's kind of like it's stimulating to, it's like a puzzle in a way. It's like exercise, you have to think about, okay, well, how can I do this visually? And there are so many possibilities. So that's the main difference between the two. I did find that screenwriting eased a lot of the pressure of storytelling, because, you don't have to do a lot of description. You don't have to do a lot of transitions. You can just cut to, and then you're on to the next scene, and the story starts to, unfold a lot faster than it does when you're writing prose.
Which do you prefer? Do you prefer one over the other, or do you just it's like putting a different hat on depending on what you're doing?
You do have to put two different hats when you're a screenwriter, when you're writing fiction. I don't know if I prefer one over the other. It really depends on the content. So there's definitely a difference between writing a screenplay that is driven by your own passion or your own inspiration, versus writing a screenplay because a producer is paying you to do it and you're doing it for the money, right? Mm-hmm. So it really depends on the content. If I'm writing a screenplay that really comes from my heart, it is one of the most pleasurable experiences. So I don't think I can say that I like one over the other. It really depends on what the project is.
Sure. So in terms of your process for, if you were sitting down to write, and you mentioned at the top of the show that you're kind of already thinking about the sequel to Weathernose, and that's formulating at the moment in your mind. When you sit down to write a novel, have you got kind of a set process? Do you like to map it out very much beforehand in terms of the story and get all the story beats down, or is it a more of a discovery and you write by the seat of your pants and just off you go? How do you prefer to work things?
Yeah, for me, it's a hybrid. My process has always been a mix of just following my intuition and seeing where the story goes. That's definitely what I did with Weathernose. But I also I think I've always had from the beginning, not beats or even an outline, but something more like moments that I wanted to arrive at.
Sure.
And those were the moments that I would sketch out in a mind map. And then all the moments in between are those that unfold intuitively as I type, right? So I do a mix of both things. Before I sit down and type out a story and start, actually banging on the keys, I like to have this period of time where I'm just, percolating, where I'm just simmering in it, and I just allow the images to come, and I just build that fire so that when I'm ready to sit down and write, I have a full tank of energy that carries the story through, and I know what moments I am aiming for. So this gives me the comfort and the structure of knowing that I know where I'm going, but I also have the freedom to move and let the muse / the intuition play with it as I go along.
Absolutely. And obviously, because your book it's written for children, for younger people, so do you have kind of an ideal reader in mind, or do you have you got some relatives or some young people that you use that kind of test out the book when you're revising it and stuff out? How do you know you're hitting the right kind of beats for that kind of audience? Because it's really tough to write for kids, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I wrote the book for kids between 8 and 12 years old, but it's definitely for adults as well.
Yeah.
We all pretend to be adults, but we're just kids inside. The book is dedicated to my little sister.
Yeah.
You'll find that in the dedication page. My little sister is one of the smartest kids. She's not a kid anymore, but when I wrote it, she was a kid. She was one of the smartest kids I'd ever met, and her playmates, my cousins, they were all a smart bunch. And I think that I may have been inspired by them a lot in my writing. So I would imagine a kid who enjoys, inventions and who enjoys, being curious about how things work. Kids who are often dubbed, too smart for their age. I think that's the kind of child I would imagine reading the book. Although, I think that I hope that different kinds of children would enjoy it as well. It's I don't think that when I marketed the book, I was like, I only want children who want to be inventors to read this. No, it's
sure. It's more like just a good story. So what, as you've kind of throughout your time writing and everything, what would you say has been your biggest challenge or roadblock you've kind of faced along the way, and how did you overcome that?
Oh, I got lost a lot on the way, because I always knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I think the practicality of being an adult got in the way. Mm-hmm. I explored with so many different creative paths because I wanted a path that would turn easily into a career that is, acceptable, quote unquote, by the workforce. And being a writer of fiction and just always felt like it's a fantasy. It's something that I wish the world would just leave me alone so that I could write. That's what I've always been saying all these years. Mm-hmm. So I got caught in that, have a job, do something useful kind of mentality. And I always put my writing in the back of my mind, until someday I was able to be grounded enough to allow myself to just call myself an author and do it. I think that was the biggest obstacle for me was the tendency to turn away from the craft, just doubting that I could make this my main priority and be okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I see what you're saying, yeah. And what would you say is kind of would you say along the way in terms of the people, and this may be writing advice or it might just be creative or whatever, but what would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given by somebody else along the way?
Oh, there's been a lot of people who have influenced me in that way. Elizabeth Gilbert is one of them, and Anne Lamott is another. Anne Lamott wrote a book. I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly, if it's Lamott or Lamott, but she wrote a book called Bird by Bird, and it was my writing Bible. I would flip through that book every time I felt like I was blocked. And she introduced the concept of the shitty first draft to me, and she called it an SFD, shitty first draft.
Yeah.
Just this mind switch that you make as a writer when you're first starting out, where you get over this need to be perfect, in the first try. So you have to allow yourself to write a shitty first draft, and once you make that switch in your head, it just gets a lot easier to go through a first draft, because a first draft really is shitty, and that's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be anything else. It's just supposed to be a word dump. You go through the story from beginning to end. It will have many plot holes. A lot of things are not going to work. Your prose is not going to be, in shape. But that's what it is. You have to get that. It's like you have a barrel of clay inside you, and what you're basically doing is just getting out of you and dumping it on the table, so that later you can shape it and fine tune it and trim it so that it looks the way you want it to look. But you can't get to that point unless you dump it on the table.
Yeah, because sometimes it can cripple you, can't it? You just sort of stop creating because you're trying to make everything perfect before it's even had a chance to land on the page. It's that whole thing about you can't edit a blank page.
Yeah, and our ability as writers to see the beauty and the perfection of what we're trying to create, or our ability to see perfection in general, it's a double-edged sword. It is what drives us to create, but it also can, become a burden along the way. So you just have to be aware of that and allow yourself to, create a shitty first draft.
Absolutely. So as we kind of move to wrapping things up, what if you were starting again tomorrow as a new writer? What, if anything, would you do differently, or what would you go back and tell your younger self, do you think?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. I would tell myself that the decision that I made in 6th grade when I decided that I wanted to write, that I wanted to be a fiction writer and publish, I would tell her that that's pretty important. That no matter what she experienced along the way or how lost she got, she would always get back there.
That's a good bit of advice. So to be a bit kinder to yourself, do you think?
Yeah, and just to trust in that instinct, that because I was a child, I was 11 or 12 years old, and I think children's instincts can be spot on. So just to trust that instinct, that truth inside you that wants to create. So if you have that in you, then you need to listen to that and make that your priority.
Absolutely.
Or a priority, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so as we kind of wrap things up, why don't you just give us a sense of what's coming next and where people can find out more about you and your book?
Oh, yeah, sure. What's coming next? I am working on a sequel for Weathernose, like I said, and I have recently finished a fantasy novel, which I hope to publish very, very soon. So fingers crossed for that. Mm-hmm. And you can find me on my website, www.maram-taibah.com. And you can also find me on Instagram. My handle is maram.taibah.author.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much. It's been great to talk to you, Maram. And
thank you.
And best of luck with the book out now and future books too.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a fun conversation.
JoinedUp writing.
Okay, thanks again to Maram Taibah, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts from to have the podcast downloaded automatically every week. Also remember to leave us a nice rating and review, please, if you would, on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps others to find the show, or, just tell a friend. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.